Welcome to the Wild Side. That was Patti Smith with Smells Like Teen Spirit. And you are listening to The Wild Side. Hello and welcome to Source 96.1 FM. You are listening to The Wild Side, and that was Patti Smith with Smells Like Teen Spirit. And I'm your host, Kight. And today on The Wild Side, I'd like to continue my recent tradition of talking about science news that's happened over the last week or so. And the first story that I want to talk a little bit about is the finding that traffic fumes disrupt the scent recognition abilities of honeybees. So bees were tested in the laboratory for their ability to recognize the aroma of flowers. And in this case, the flowers that were used were those from the oilseed rape plant. Now, honeybees are very sensitive to smell, and they're very good at both learning and memorizing new smells. So, of course, this would be quite an important thing to find out if there's something out there that we're doing that could disrupt their ability to smell. And the reason that they're so good at this is that they use the information to home in on appropriate sources of food. So this allows them to kind of bypass the need to just randomly wander around until they smell a flower and kind of cue in on it in order to feed. So this is something that they use very much, and then they take that information back once they've used their smell to locate a flower, and they can provide that information to their hive mates. So it is a really important thing because it affects not just one individual, but the whole hive. So what they did, and this sounds kind of weird, is they actually strapped the bees down and taught them to associate floral scents with the presence of a sugar solution, in other words, with food. So basically, they would kind of waft the scent around the bees, and at the same time they would waft the scent, or just afterwards, they would present the animals with some sugar solution. So they got to the point where the bees definitely knew that that floral smell was associated with something that they could eat, to the point even that after they would smell the scents, they would stick out their tongues in preparation to feed, even when they weren't actually offered the food. So they definitely learned very much this was an important smell. So in the presence of no diesel pollutants, so when there was no other smell in the laboratory except for the smell of the flowers, the bees were reacting appropriately, quote unquote, to that scent. So 98 to 99% of the time, when they would smell the floral scent, they would stick out their tongues and prepare to feed. However, when the scent was mixed with diesel exhaust fumes, and the researchers did this at levels that were comparable to those that are measured at a roadside, so where the bees, the kind of conditions under which the bees might actually be exposed to these sorts of things, they could only recognize scents about 30% of the time. So in other words, about a third of the time when they smelled this mixture of things, they would stick out their tongues, and the other 70% or so of time, they didn't have any reaction at all. So in the real world, this suggests that about 70% of the time, bees in areas with lots of diesel fumes would just keep on flying. They wouldn't hone in on the flowers. They wouldn't get the food that they need, and maybe they'd end up spending a lot more time looking around for food than ordinarily they would need to, or that they have the time to do. So this could be quite a significant finding. Now, what the researchers also found was that the part of the fumes that seemed to be having the biggest impact was the highly reactive nitrogen oxides. And these things appear to have changed the floral scent in the air. So what happened is not that the scent of the diesel was just so strong that it overpowered the more delicate scent of the flowers, but instead these chemicals within the diesel fumes were reacting with the chemicals in the floral scent, and they were altering their structure and therefore altering their smell within a minute or so of kind of being combined up in the air. And this meant that the bees weren't able to then smell them. The structure was different, so there was a different reaction within the bee's sensory system, and so of course this produced a very different behavioral response, or in fact none at all. Now, nitrogen oxides are some of the most reactive gases that are produced from the combustion of diesel and other fuels as well. And there are emissions limits on these things, but it looks as though they are regularly exceeded, and this is especially true in urban areas. So even though we do have kind of restrictions on these things, they aren't really heavily enforced, and so this is definitely still a problem. And emissions are particularly high from petrol vehicles, which of course there are many of in this area. Diesel produces nanoparticle pollutants, however, so both of these types of fuel are quite bad. And in fact, the nanoparticle pollutants can be dangerous to humans as well. So these things might not only impact the bees, but also humans, although the researchers of this particular study didn't quite go into detail in terms of comparing how the two different species would be impacted, and whether in fact we might even have similar kind of smell problems, although obviously that might not have quite the same impact as it does on bees. And what's really great is that the researchers have followed up on this study with something in the field. So they haven't just done a lab study and taken that isolated data to mean something about the outside world. They have also performed studies out in the field, and they're currently analyzing those data in order to see whether they show the same sorts of patterns as those that were found inside in that kind of artificial setup. Now, of course, pending the results of that study, the researchers do make some suggestions based on their current findings. And one of these is that the disruption of flower odors might not just be important for bees, but also many other insects as well. And this could have really big economic and ecological impacts because 3/4 of our food crops rely on pollinators like bees and other organisms as well. And this has an estimated value of approximately 135 billion pounds. So anything that is interfering with this process and reducing the efficacy of these animals and the efficiency of these animals to do these tasks could have a really serious knock-on effect to the agricultural department and the agricultural industry, but also to the ecology of these areas where these crops are grown because, well, and also natural crops as well, natural plants as well, I should say. Because when you've got these bees and these other insects that are pollinating things, they're keeping a lot of species going, they're affecting where these species are going to end up and kind of the distribution of things, and the habitat, of course, is going to have a big influence on what animals are around and what ecosystem functions are going on. So this does have a really serious and wide-ranging repercussion depending on kind of the extent of this impact. The researchers also mentioned that this particular pattern is likely a part of the honeybee decline that has received lots of attention. You've probably already heard about this quite a lot, but it's probably not the only factor. So we know that there are lots of other problems that are facing bees right now, including loss of habitat, disease, use of insecticides, and all sorts of things like this that probably, even though one of them may be much more of a problem than the others, there's definitely a kind of interaction of all of these things in bringing down the honeybee populations. So one thing that the researchers do hope, just to kind of sum up here, is that, we are the ones who are producing these fumes, and these fumes are having an impact on the bees. And of course this impact could kind of have a roundabout effect on us as well. So maybe it's time for us to kind of look at these laws that we have in place in terms of what can be in the fuels, what sorts of additives are in there, what sorts of compounds, could we filter them in some way, and also just think about the amounts that we're allowing to be produced in any given area. So maybe this is a good time for us to kind of stop and review all of these things and maybe come up with some new laws or better testing or better just going out and actually enforcing the ones that we have in place right now. So this is a good point for us to kind of take some stock and maybe take some action to help the bees. Now, on a very related topic, I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of flowering plants. And this sounds like very old news because obviously it happened millions of years ago. But the reason that it is being talked about right now is that there have been some newly uncovered fossils that have provided evidence that flowering plants existed about 100 million years earlier than we previously thought. And this is quite an exciting thing if you think back to one of the things I talked about either last week or the week before, the recent finding that there were some very old soil samples indicating that there was oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere much earlier than we thought, which suggests that life on Earth could have developed much earlier than we thought. So right on the heels of that, we find out that flowering plants existed earlier than we thought. And maybe this is just kind of unrelated, it happens to be a coincidence. But it also could be that, we do know that life could have existed earlier, so maybe it did develop earlier, which allowed plants to come into being earlier than we thought. So maybe they are kind of connected as well. It's quite an interesting kind of pattern to think about. So what do we already know about flowering plants, and why is this new result interesting? Well, we know that all flowering plants evolved from species that are now extinct, but were related to conifers and ginkgos and cycads and seed ferns. So a bunch of plants that we typically refer to as kind of primitive plants. And a lot of these things you may have seen actually around here in town, because there are lots of these things growing out in people's yards. Ginkgos are a really popular kind of ornamental tree, and I do see cycads around as well. So there are extinct species of these things that gave rise to flowering plants. And in fact, we have what the researchers refer to as an uninterrupted sequence of samples. And these samples are fossilized pollen that date back to the early Cretaceous period, or about 140 million years ago. So we have a really excellent record of the development of these plants and their kind of gradual change from one type of plant to another, in terms at least of their pollen. Obviously we don't always know what the whole plant looks like and what its leaves look like and that sort of thing, but we can trace a lot of change via the pollen samples. So this 140 million year kind of cutoff mark was previously thought to be the time when the flowering plants first emerged. So researchers had previously thought, there were no other older samples found, so this was likely the actual beginning of the flowering plant. But in fact, there has now been some additional discovery in a couple of different places actually that helps move that mark even further back in time. And what they found is new fossils of what they referred to as flowering plant-like pollen. And these are about 100 million years older, and they are clearly pollen, and they are clearly very much like flowering plants, but they're actually maybe kind of in an intermediate stage between those early primitive things that I talked about and the flowering plants that we know from today. So the ones that were particularly discussed in this new study that has come out were located in cores that were drilled in northern Switzerland. And the researchers used a very specialized type of microscopy to obtain high-resolution 3D images of 6 different types of pollen. So it wasn't just one sample, but in fact 6 different species. And given the samples in which these things were taken from, the cores and all the other stuff that was in those samples, they've dated them back to about 252 to 247 million years ago. So this is adding, about 100 million years to that original date. And these same researchers have previously found other pollen as well that's not quite as old, but is still quite old. And those were found about 3,000 kilometers away from the North Switzerland study site. And they again were found in cores, and these samples were dated to the Middle Triassic. So taken together, the fact that we've got these two studies from quite a distance apart, so the samples probably weren't contaminated or anything like that, both dating things back to the Triassic period, this suggests that there is most likely an original date of flower speciation before the Cretaceous, and this is, much older than we previously had thought. And in previous studies, these guys talk about how researchers have tried to use molecular data to estimate the age of flowering plants. And this is something that is done increasingly now as we sequence a lot of genomes and can do quite a lot of comparative work on a molecular level. But the problem with this is that a lot of molecular estimates are kind of grounded in fossil evidence as well. So you've got to have something that kind of puts it in the context and gives you some foundation for associating certain things with certain ages, and then you can kind of use that baseline information to then calculate the clock and know how much further before or after another type of sample was when you're comparing two things. But unfortunately, we didn't have a whole lot of samples that were as old as they needed to be in order to really create that fossil foundation for these molecular studies. So this new stuff basically opens up a whole new realm of research. So now that we do have these really old fossil samples, we can kind of recalculate and potentially reset all of these clocks and get better estimates of when did things emerge, how far before one thing did another emerge, and so on. So we can have a much more complete picture of this very early period in fossil flower development. Well, sorry, not fossil flowers. We kind of know how those developed, but the ancient flowers and when they were first evolving from these pre-flowering plant species. Now, the researchers also do say a little bit about what the plants might have looked like, and this is quite a general interpretation of what it looks like. It's more like what would these plants kind of have been like. So we know that areas from which the cores were taken would have been in the subtropics back at this, 240 million years ago kind of area of time. But the oldest pollen grains were collected in areas that were actually quite dry. So we do know that it's kind of, there's a range of stuff going on within that general ecological landscape, but particularly where the pollen grains are, it was quite a dry kind of tropical area. So right away we see that the plants are distributed across a really wide range, so they probably have quite a lot of different capabilities already, the ability to deal with different types of temperature, different types of humidity, different types of weather, that sort of thing. And also the structure of the pollen grains suggested that they were the type of things that would have been associated with plants that were pollinated by beetles. Bees hadn't yet evolved at this stage of time, so beetles were probably quite important. So if you look at those two kind of vague properties, and I know that is very little information to go on, but you can kind of begin to isolate some plants that were found across a wide range, but particularly in kind of subtropical areas that were a bit drier, and also are pollinated by beetles. So if we start to scour the literature, we might be able to pull out some of these plants that we already know about, and then maybe get an idea, assuming that, these traits don't just exist in isolation, assuming that maybe a certain type of plant that has those characteristics is going to look kind of similar to another plant that has them as well. We might be able to then kind of get a basic idea of what morphologies these long extinct plants would have had. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Dr. Caitlin Kight, and that was Steve Martin with Pretty Flowers. And in case you weren't listening before the break, we are talking a little bit about recent science news this week, and I was talking a little bit about flowers and about honeybees, and now I want to completely change it up and make it a bit more exciting. Maybe you're not into insects and flowers, so I now want to talk about volcanic eruptions. So hopefully that will pull you in a little bit if you were thinking the first bit was a bit too nice and gentle. And the reason that volcanic eruptions are in the news this week is that scientists have uncovered probably the source of a huge volcanic eruption that occurred during the 13th century and may have been the thing that ushered in what's often known as the Little Ice Age. So in 1257 AD, we know that there was a volcanic explosion that was extremely intense. It was 8 times stronger than Krakatoa, which you may have heard about, and also 2 times larger than Tambora. And both of these things occurred in the 19th century, and so we do know quite a lot about them, and we know how highly they impacted societies living around the world. So they were a really big deal, but this one is even bigger than that. And in fact, it's so big that it is the largest such eruption that's occurred in the last 3,700 years. So this is one of those things that only happens every so often, and when it does, it has an incredibly big impact on basically the whole globe. So what's amazing is that this event, of course, because it was such a huge thing, it was recorded, but then it was eventually kind of forgotten over time. However, about 30 years or so ago, glaciologists found evidence of the volcanic activity in some samples that they collected. And that is because when the volcano erupted, there were about 10 cubic miles of debris that were ejected up, way high up into the atmosphere, so kind of 30 miles high up in the sky. And this all traveled around the world and eventually settled down. And as the ash settled, it then became, kind of covered up with other sediments over time, and then it can now be extracted in cores. And that's how it was found by these glaciologists who found it in ice cores. And of course, also, the ash was settling on other surfaces as well, where it was buried much more, so on sediments, on the water, things where it can be a bit harder to get these really good, pristine samples. But nearest the volcano itself, there are also very thick deposits, and I'll get back to those in a little bit. So ever since this hint of this eruption was first found about 30 years ago, volcanologists have been looking for the source of the eruption. Obviously, it's quite an interesting thing because it was so massive, and so it is something that could offer us a chance to find out lots of new information about these really powerful volcanoes. And they focused on regions all over the place. They really had no idea where this volcano erupted. So one of them was in New Zealand, one of them was in Mexico. They were really scouring the whole Earth. And one of the reasons they're so excited about this is that they thought maybe it created kind of a Pompeii of the Far East. So if you know about the explosion of Vesuvius, then you know that everything happened so quickly and then cooled so quickly that there were just tons of artifacts and people and plants and all sorts of things that were encased in everything that was deposited by the volcano. And then researchers are still going in and extracting all of these things and learning a lot about the habitat and about the people. And so they're hoping that maybe in wherever region this volcano is located, they might be able to have a similar thing where they can unearth these buried ruins that are just waiting to be explored and analyzed. So it's a bit of a kind of a treasure hunt in a sense, and that's why everyone's been so excited about this new finding. And the researchers that did kind of maybe finally crack the puzzle were a really interdisciplinary research team, and this is what they say is what helped them actually finally figure this out, because the team included geologists, geochemists, geographers, historians, radiocarbon dating specialists, all sorts of people with different areas of expertise and different skills that they could bring so they could analyze all sorts of different data in order to really try to narrow down the options and all the different places that they were looking at. And among other things, they were looking at radiocarbon dating results, volcanic ejecta chemistry, stratigraphic data, historical writings, and previous individuals had done some work on each one of these things, but it was all done independently. No one had ever actually worked together and compiled all of this and then followed up on each new lead as a team. So this is what really seemed to have given them the edge, the fact that they could use all of this simultaneously to point them in the right direction. So they started off by sampling over 130 locations in order to create a detailed picture of how the eruption occurred. So basically they were taking all of these core samples and sediment samples and tree trunk samples and all sorts of things in order to get an idea of what areas were affected and which areas were affected the most, because that would allow them to kind of create basically a kind of a map, like a hot zone sort of map, where you can see the areas that are least affected and the areas that are most affected, and theoretically the ones that are most affected, that kind of red zone, would be the ones that are closest to where the volcano actually is located. So hopefully the idea was that this could help them pinpoint the actual site. Now one of the things that they did was perform radiocarbon dating of tree trunks and also branches, and they did this along the two volcanoes that they kind of eventually narrowed down as being potentially the most likely. And these were the Samalas volcano and the Rinjani volcano. And they found that no samples were found younger than the year 1257, and that suggests that that's when all the vegetation in the area had been killed off, or in other words, that's when the volcano had actually erupted. And this was something that was quite useful because it did rule out other volcanoes that had also kind of gone off in a very large way, so they might have been, the one they were looking for, except that the timing was different. They had other sorts of vegetation around that indicated it wasn't quite the right age. Now the researchers also looked at volcanic sulfate and tephra that were found in ice core samples from both Greenland and Antarctica, so at both poles of the globe, and this allowed them to create a geochemical fingerprint. And this was something that allowed them to pinpoint a site of an eruption that had a tropical origin. And the glass shards were a very poor match to an Ecuadorian volcano that they thought, again, might have been one of the culprits here. And this particular volcano, named Kilauea, also had a really good match with the timeline, so it was looking quite promising. But the glass shards were a much better match to Samalas, which again was that other volcano that they had analyzed the tree data from. So there are lots of things now beginning to compile to suggest that it was the Samalas volcano. And a large-scale climatological analysis revealed that the eruption disrupted the climate around the world for at least 20 years. And they were able to discover this by looking at growth rates in tree rings, and you can see kind of abnormalities that suggest that conditions were really harsh because the trees weren't getting enough sunlight or enough nutrients. They were kind of smothered by the ash, and then the clouds, of course, would cut out the sunlight. So they were able to get an idea of how this was affecting vegetation around the world, and that can also help you kind of get an idea of how it might affect people relying on that vegetation. Climate models and also historical records were revealing even more detail about this. So, for example, medieval chronicles indicated that there was an especially cold summer in 1258, so the very year right after that eruption. And the summer was marked by poor harvests, lots of rain, and a lack of flooding. The next winter was also much warmer, so this was likely because of high sulfur eruptions from the volcano that were changing what was happening in the atmosphere and then what came down from the sun through that atmosphere to us here on the surface. So records indicate that there were days that had frost that melted almost immediately, and also periods of blooming and even fruit production in January. So everything was really messed up because of this immense volcanic activity. Now, really, the cool thing that helped kind of blow this wide open and really pinpoint the Samalas volcano was the fact that there were actually records near where the volcano was located in Indonesia. And these records indicated a much harsher condition in that Indonesian region than even the conditions that were described in Europe. So this suggests that, in fact, the volcano was closer to Indonesia than Europe, and indeed the Samalas volcano was. And these texts were written on palm leaves, and they discuss the blast and also observations that there was a caldera that had formed, and they describe the death of thousands of people who were affected by ash and lava. So it goes into quite a lot of detail. But as you can imagine, it's on, kind of an unusual surface. These things are in another language. They're probably buried deep somewhere in a library or a museum, and so people just hadn't really analyzed this information previously and attached it to this volcano. Some of the records specifically mention how Pamatan, the capital of the kingdom, was struck very hard. And it mentioned also how the surrounding lands of the capital were highly affected. And this is the thing that researchers have compared to Pompeii, suggesting that this region, which, because it was the capital, would have likely had lots of things, buildings, people, archaeological artifacts, all sorts of things, that would have been potentially buried by the volcanic deposits. Volcanic deposits. And the question is, was the volcanic eruption something like Vesuvius, where it would have just kind of frozen everything at once? Or was it more like a Mount St. Helens kind of explosion, where it would have just taken everything out and completely destroyed it? And the thing is that they don't really know. And so now that they have kind of isolated this volcanic suspect, if you like, they can now go to it and begin to dig in earnest and try to see what it's like there on the ground. And the really amazing thing about all of this is that really, if they hadn't had those historical records, it would have been hard to have that kind of last bit of the puzzle to really say this probably is the volcano that they're looking for. And it's actually quite a tricky thing, because a volcano, it has lots of really negative effects on things. So if the people writing those texts had been too close, they probably would have been killed. But if they'd been too far, they might not actually have had the right kind of observations, or the most specific observations that were needed to really pinpoint that it was the Samalas volcano. So whoever created these palm leaf texts were in exactly the right spot to record the right kind of data to help really solve this puzzle, which makes it kind of all the more exciting that people were able to finally put all these things together and locate that information and then really solve the mystery. Welcome back to The Wild Side on Source 96.1 FM. That was Deb Talon with Ashes on Your Eyes, and I am your host, Caitlin Kight. And this week I'm talking a little bit about some recent science news. And just before the break I was talking about volcanoes, so I'll go ahead and keep it on this kind of large geographical scale and talk now about giant channels that have been discovered beneath the Antarctic ice shelf. And this is actually a finding that is associated with many institutions, but one of the researchers, or actually maybe even multiple researchers, were from the University of Exeter. So I do want to kind of give a little shout out to my employer for taking part in this kind of exciting result. So these channels can be seen on both the surface of the ice shelf and also underneath it. And researchers have seen this for a while, and now they finally have some really kind of cool tech stuff that allow them to explore these features in more detail and get a better understanding of what is going on. And in fact, as you'll see in a minute, their understanding has maybe even changed what we know about ice shelves in general. So it's actually quite an exciting thing. So ice shelves, just to kind of give us a little bit of grounding, not that I'm an expert in glaciology or anything, but ice shelves, from my understanding, they will kind of float at different levels depending on the weight of the ice. So if you've got really heavy bits, it's going to kind of sink down lower than if you've got lighter bits, obviously, which will float up a bit higher. So that's why you can kind of see channels to different extents in different locations, because the different size of the ice shelf from one place to another is going to kind of cause it to orient itself in a particular way. And so you're going to be able to see the channels in some places and not so much in others. And so we only know so much about these channels because you can't dig underneath a glacier. You can only see really what's there on top. Well, until now that is. And so that's why these things have kind of remained mysterious, even though there is evidence of them if you're standing there and just kind of looking out at the ice shelf. So what the researchers did was take some satellite images and some airborne radar measurements, and that allowed them to finally explore the parts of these ice shelves that they couldn't see. And what they found is that the channels that they could kind of get some evidence of from the surface were actually incredibly huge and very long. And some of them were up to 250 meters high, and that's nearly as high as the Eiffel Tower, just for a bit of perspective. So we're talking about really massive structures here. And they can stretch for hundreds of kilometers along the ice shelf. I almost said ice elf, which sounds like a really exciting thing, but definitely off topic. So these ice shelves obviously are really massive structures to be able to encompass these very large channels within them. And the channels are just, they've just been dug out, and so they are these furrows basically through the ice. And one of the things that has a really big impact on this is meltwater. And so meltwater flows underneath the ice sheet, and the ice sheet is the part of ice that's in contact with the land. And so the researchers on this study looked at kind of where they saw the meltwater forming, where they saw it starting to emerge and then flow. And based on that information, they predicted the path that they thought that it would take once it actually hit the ice shelf and started to go underneath it. And what they found was that their predictions of where the water would flow matched up very well with the channels. And so this suggested obviously that there is this close interaction between the water and the channel. And in fact, it suggests that the water is actually helping to form these channels. And the water flow beneath the grounded ice is what appears to be responsible for this. So basically what seems to happen is that the meltwater is entering the oceans beneath the ice shelf. So it kind of goes under the ice from the terrestrial bit and is entering the ocean. And when it does this, it creates these plumes of ocean water, which kind of flow forward like little arrows and just push their way through the ice and create these channels. So obviously you have to have quite a lot of water over time and quite a long time for them to push their way through and make these massive channels that they've created underwater. And this indicates that there is quite a focused manner of flow. So basically the meltwater is functioning like a river might or like a creek might as it's pushing its way through the soil and making its way down to the mouth and out into an estuary. And so that's actually a really nice image to hold in your mind, because you all know what that looks like. You all live around areas of water, most likely, because there are tons of rivers and creeks around here. And so you can kind of envision that same process, but just happening with ice and water and kind of underneath a glacier. And what's really different about this is that previously researchers had thought that when that meltwater hit the ice sheet, it would just be kind of flattened out by the weight of the ice sheet. So it would form this really thin layer that spread out underneath the sheet and then would kind of trickle out into the ocean from there. And basically under that scenario, it might have a little bit of effect on the bottom of the glacier, but probably not a whole lot, because that is a very thin sheet. It may not have as much power as a really focused river of water. So this is quite different, because it suggests that that water is having a big influence on the structure of the ice and potentially on the movement of it as well, because it is changing what's happening on the bottom, potentially helping it to kind of float out into the water and move forward into the water. So this could be having a really huge impact on the future of the glacier. And The researchers do point out that other large channels have been found in the past, but this is the first one that's been really clearly linked with meltwater activity rather than processes that kind of occurred within the ocean itself underneath the ice. So, the waves of the ocean, the salt of the ocean, whatever is happening in the ocean itself can also influence the bottom of the ice sheet, as you might expect. But this is the first time that there is really good evidence that it's actually the meltwater that's doing this and not the ocean. And the researchers hope that this information, besides kind of upending previously held beliefs, can also potentially be useful in creating projections that are associated with understanding how climate change and variations in sea level might begin to impact glaciers and ice shelves and ice sheets over time, because this will allow us to kind of get a better idea of how much meltwater is going to be generated, what kind of effects that amount of meltwater might have, and how that can then maybe have a kind of a circular effect by, starting off a cycle where you've got suddenly glaciers falling off into the ocean and then melting and then creating more meltwater, etc., etc. So this is maybe a really important thing for getting an idea of what's going to continue to happen as climate change takes its toll. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was Jenny Lewis and the Watson Twins singing Melt Your Heart. And I'm your host, Caitlin Kight, and today here on the Wild Side we are talking about some recent science news. And the last story that I want to address today is one that is actually kind of American-centric, but it is quite interesting, and it does have kind of knock-on effects on to anyone who might be impacted by the American corn industry. And since the American corn industry is responsible for both food and ethanol around the world, it probably does have a bit of an impact here on us in the UK. So this particular story is kind of an interesting thing because it's not exactly a brand new research result, but it is an expose kind of a situation that's been happening and developing over the last few years. And this situation is the rise of a disease known as Gauss's wilt. And the disease is caused by a bacterium that's known as Clavibacter michiganensis subspecies nebraskensis. Not the most pithy or succinct of names. But basically what happens is the plants that are afflicted by this have been damaged by hail or other kinds of heavy and extreme weather, and that causes wounds, and then the microbes enter the wounds and then create an infection of the plant's vascular system. And morphologically what happens then is that the leaves get really scarred, kind of brownish yellow color, they have little black freckles, and the plant may or may not die, but almost always it will produce less corn. And obviously this is quite a bad thing because farmers need to have quite a lot of corn in order to make back their money. And for example, in 2011, which was a really bad year for Gauss's wilt, some farmers lost as many as 60 bushels of corn per acre, and normally they would have a yield of about 200 bushels per acre. So we're talking almost a third or so of their corn would be lost because of this disease, and that obviously is something that needs to be addressed. Now Gauss's wilt, and this is where it really starts to get interesting, was virtually unknown about 5 years ago, and it's only been in the last couple years that it's become a real problem, and it has been spreading very rapidly since then. So prior to about 2008, it was confined mostly to a single state, Nebraska, and then a few counties in a neighboring state as well. But suddenly then it was found in 4 others, and then after that increasing again to 8, a half dozen, something along those lines, and eventually even more. And it's particularly problematic in the Midwestern portion of the U.S. where corn is grown in quite large numbers. And the last 2 years have been a little bit better because the weather has been drier and it has been hotter, so there hasn't been that initial condition to really start off the infection process. And so this has allowed scientists to take a little bit of time to kind of stand back and look at this problem and try to solve it before the weather gets bad again and the crops really get hit hard. So the big question is why Gauss's wilt has become such a problem recently when it wasn't one before. And some people think that it's linked to the fact that there are certain hybrids that are chosen for genetic modification and then distributed by the seed companies. And their focus tends to be on yield potentials rather than on other things that are kind of secondary, like immune function or sturdiness. And you might think, quite rightly, that those couple of things, immune function and sturdiness, can have a big impact on yield potential, and that's true. But sometimes yield potential can be kind of divorced from those things, and so as they focused on that particular characteristic, some of these other things were lost, and so the plants weren't kind of all around as good as they might have been. And because about 90% of American corn comes from seeds that have been engineered in the lab, this means that you can easily kind of breed a trait out and then distribute that corn so that you've lost that thing that you need. So it has something that you want, but maybe it doesn't have everything that it needs under certain circumstances. And few seeds are resistant to Gauss's wilt. So this is obviously going to be a very big problem, because the moment it emerges in a population, there really is no way for those plants to fight it, and so they do fall very hard. So maybe it has been the case that over time the companies have gotten rid of the genes that were necessary, and so they're only left with this corn that's going to be highly susceptible. However, a rep from Monsanto, of course a very suspect company we all know, has suggested that there could be other problems as well. And actually these suggestions probably aren't incorrect, although I would say that probably there are multiple things working together here. And what this representative has said is that there is a reduction in rotation in current kind of farm techniques, and so that makes wilt more likely, because you have more corn around more often, and that promotes the exchange of the disease from one plant to another, and it kind of keeps it in the area. Another problem is that farmers are now more interested in something called no-till farming. And this leaves behind plant parts, and plant parts can harbor the bacteria, which again keep that bacteria around in the atmosphere, in the environment, so that it's there to potentially affect the new growth of plants. And right now, the scary thing is there are no hybrids being sold by these companies that can fully withstand Gauss's wilt. But the companies have responded to the problem by increasing the production and sales of seeds that do have higher resistance. So maybe the trait that was lost in the past can eventually kind of be reintroduced, or at least kind of buffered a little bit by finding plants that are slightly better than the ones that we've got out there today. And then hopefully over time this problem will kind of die down a little bit, or at least not be quite as bad as it has been over the last few years. So with that, I will end up with the very appropriate Alison Krauss and Union Station song, The Boy Who Wouldn't Hoe Corn. And that's it for me this week, and I will talk to you next week.